time to begin. So I want to welcome everyone to our K Lunch and Learn. And I think it's a topic that you'll find very interesting about hiring people for your research teams and your labs. And I've got two very excellent speakers to talk to you about that, share their wisdom and experience. And first will be Mary Frestad, who's Professor Emerita at OSU and Director of Academic Affairs and Research Development at the Nationwide Children's Hospital Behavioral Health Center. And then she will be followed by and joined by Trez Rezwansky, who is Assistant Professor in the College of Pharmacy and research at the Dorothy M. Davis Heart and Lung Research Institute at Ohio State. So I will turn it over to, I guess Mary will go first and make her presentation. And please feel free to put comments into the chat, or probably they will not be offended if you just speak up and ask a question. And we'd like, they have some ideas to share with you, and then have much time at the end then for further question and discussion.
Okay, so glad to be with you all today, and I will be talking about building your lab. Some general considerations to think about is the size of your team, and will you make use of what we would call a vertical team, again, with kind of you at the top, and then kind of stepping stone trainees. And this can be as elaborate, as large or small as makes sense in your setting, but kind of starting at the bottom, I would say volunteers, and we'll talk about each of these categories, then students, hired research assistants, students could be undergraduates or graduate students, and postdocs. So if we think about each of those team members, you want to make it, for all of them, make it worth their while. But I have found, particularly as you're getting started building, and I'm guessing that most of the folks on this call are probably a bit early in their career, which also may mean that you don't have a large budget to fund your lab. And I frequently, over the years, I was at OSU for 34 years before coming over here to Nationwide Children's, and I've been here about a year and a half, did not always have a robust budget. But one of the beautiful things about being on the OSU campus in particular is that you've got a huge undergraduate population, and these are young people very eager to acquire research experience. So there are a variety of ways that you can offer this to people, even if you don't have much of a budget or a small budget. So when we think about what are the carrots that we can offer for really everybody on your team, but particularly those students who maybe are going to get course credit, or volunteers who you have over a summer or over an academic year, they are going to develop skills. And if they are thinking about a career, any kind of an advanced degree, they will need to demonstrate that they have some skills. They also very much want letters of recommendation. And so that's a very important carrot that we have to offer. They also then would have the possibility of getting presentations and publications out of their work. And then if you actually are hiring somebody, there's obviously the salary. And over the years, not that I was trying to be cheap, but salary was kind of the least relevant part of what I had to offer. Because in hiring a research assistant, my general rule of thumb was to really request a 2 to 3 year commitment, knowing that they would be moving on. The best RAs are typically those who have tremendous, what I would call high scores on their hustle index, because they really want to garner the experience and then move on themselves. NIH, of course, has a standard postdoc rate, which I adhere to in the standard benefits package. But beyond that, it's less about the salary and so much more about those other carrots that we have to offer. You want to think about what are the necessary skill sets of anybody you bring into the lab, and that will vary dramatically based on what your work setting is. Are there certain lab techniques that they need to know before they can join your lab? Do they need certain background coursework? Do you want them? I found for my undergraduates, unless I had a very compelling reason to do otherwise, I only took juniors and seniors because I found that the freshmen and sophomores, by and large, did not have yet the maturity to really work well and independently in the lab. And by independent, certainly not, they weren't left on their own, but they needed a lot more supervision. That being said, my own kids went through college as I was doing this, and they both had the opportunity to start research at a very, in their freshman year, or their first year. And so it made me kind of pause and try to be a bit more open because I saw how much it benefited my own children to start their research careers early. And then it's incredibly important, I think, to foster a very rigorous and caring atmosphere. So rigorous, we all care about the ethics, the quality of our science. But if you want a really loyal team that's really going to throw themselves into the work, it really helps to care about the people. So kind of really demonstrating that you care about them as human beings as well as their own professional development, I think is helpful. So where do we find these different people? In terms of volunteers, typically these might be postbacks who have gotten their undergraduate degree and now are thinking, you know, what I really want to do is ... And working in your lab would give me great exposure to connecting the dots. So I've had a variety of volunteers in that capacity. Also, because Columbus is a large place, what I found oftentimes was that without even trying, I would have students kind of plop into my lab for summer rotations. These typically are people who go to college, university, other than in Columbus, but are returning home for the summer. And again, under the auspices of limited budgets, the way I typically would work that was to say, give me 20 hours a week. I'm not paying you. This is a one summer with the opportunity to come back in the following summer. And because I'm not paying you, you tell me the 20 hours a week that you can work, that my lab is, you know, in operation within that confine. And then tell me the weeks that you're going to be away. You've got a family vacation, your best friend's wedding, whatever it is that's going to take you away. Take that time away. Don't feel like you can't leave. Number one, I'm not paying you. Number two, life is short and life keeps happening while we work. So I've had really positive experiences with students doing these, for me, freebie summer. We can't call them internships at OSU because of some of the classification of job categories. I used to call them internships until we had to call them something else. So I had summer volunteers. But that's a really great way to bring somebody in, get a lot of work done. So from my lab's perspective, I would always have a useful task that they could do. From their perspective, they were, again, gaining skill and opportunity, and some of the best ones would come back for repeated summers. For undergraduates, something you might want to think about, again, when you think about the requirements or what you are going to ask of an undergraduate, I would suggest that you consider a 2-semester minimum, and you might want to set the bar higher than that. But having somebody for only 1 semester, you spend as much time training them as you get kind of anything out of it. And again, not to be mercenary, but I always want this to be a win-win. And so I don't want my staff to invest more time in a trainee than I'm going to get back in terms of the work. I want everybody to come out a winner at the end. So typically I would request a 2-semester minimum. And again, depending upon how labor intensive some of the training is for whatever tasks you have, you might want to up that to a 3-semester or a 12-month commitment. You also might want to think about a GPA requirement. In my 34 years at OSU, OSU really increased the quality in general of the undergraduate student body. When I first came to OSU, it would be pretty easy to find students with an AB average who were, shall we say, less impressive than they were in my final years at OSU. I think the quality of the students really has been enhanced, but you might want to think about a GPA minimum below which you really don't wish to go. It becomes kind of a useful screen, not the only screen you want, but a useful screen. In terms of research assistants, I would imagine that all of you have professional listservs, and I have found it very helpful to use listservs to do a national search for, again, people who might be graduating at that post-bac level, which is an ideal time to nab somebody for about a 2-year commitment or longer. But that way, rather than just recruiting from OSU, which does give you a really good base, but it gives you the opportunity then to do a national search. And given that we've all gotten very comfortable with Zoom, it's very easy now to do Zoom interviews. In terms of postdocs, I've listed the link. You probably are all familiar with the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs that OSU sponsors. It's a very useful resource. They also host every year the Presidential Postdoctoral Scholarship Program that brings in about 10 PPSP fellows every year for a 2-year commitment. And if you are fortunate enough, and I had a PPSP postdoc the first year that the program was inaugurated at OSU, it pays for about 2/3 of the cost of the postdoc. So it's a really great way, again, number one, to stretch your research dollars. Number two, it's a great feather in the cap of whoever receives that award because it's really a prestigious award. And then there's a postdoc fair that is useful if you are looking for somebody in the basic sciences. I didn't find it helpful for my own purposes because of my behavioral health needs. The kind of postdocs who come to the postdoc fair were less applicable, and I had other means of finding them. Again, really using a listserv to find postdocs. So those are my general comments. I think we are a small group, so I will stop sharing and seeing if anybody wants to simply unmute and ask me questions. Otherwise, I'll turn this over to my counterpart.
I was just wondering, how do you do this to the listserv? I was not aware of that.
So how to use a listserv? Was that Matthew Cherian? Matthew, I don't know what department you're in or what your specialty is, but I would imagine you have some professional organization. For myself, I have actually about a half dozen listservs. I'm member of a number of professional organizations, most closely allied with one of them. And so I would put a postdoc, I would put like either a research coordinator position or a postdoc position out on the listserv with instructions on how to apply, and just wait for applications to come trickling in. Again, that really allows for a national recruitment strategy, which is for postdocs is particularly useful because there would be fewer just in the Columbus area who would have the, for my needs, would have the relevant background and training. Does that help, Matthew?
Yeah, so if when I go to the usual, so if you go to AACR, for example, you're saying that there's a way you can advertise there for free or through a listserv connected to AACR or something like that. Is that what you mean?
Well, I don't know that particular conference. Again, chances are good that you are in a basic science area of which I'm particularly ignorant. But whether you are, well, what is your area?
Well, American Association of Cancer Research is AACR, and then there's
okay.
American Cancer Society, ACS.
Okay. Okay. So chances are, if you're looking for postdocs, I would think that at the meetings as well as within those organizations, there's probably some kind of a virtual now job board at national meetings. Back in the old days when we used to go to these meetings in person, there were oftentimes opportunities to do interviews face-to-face at the meeting. So that's another way of utilizing those meetings to your advantage. But again, if you, if your listserv, and again, not knowing those organizations, I don't know, but if you have an active listserv, this sometimes works, maybe it works a little bit better in kind of smaller, more specialized, a bit more guild related. kinds of groups. It's like my professional national society is where I've gotten the best yield, but then there are also other national groups of which I'm a member that I will also send these notices out to. So I think, and that probably is a bit different from discipline to discipline.
I saw an excellent question in the chat. When starting a lab, would you recommend hiring a research assistant or a postdoc first?
Really depends upon what your needs are. So if you need to start running your experiments, if you need the sophistication of a postdoc, obviously postdocs will probably cost a bit more depending upon the level of credentials of the research assistant. Usually a postdoc would cost more. So depending upon what your budget is like and what your job requirements are like, what level of assistance do you need? Postdocs should be able to contribute at a much higher technical and writing level than an RA. But if you need to just get a lot of experiments run and a lot of the work is at a kind of lower technical level, then I would probably say start with an RA. So again, it depends so much on your setting and what your needs are to really jumpstart your work at OSU or NCH.
And would a graduate student sort of fit somewhere between both of those?
So graduate students are really interesting. They're expensive. And if you have an NIH grant, or a federal grant with the full indirects, and I've not kept up with the OSU policy since leaving main campus or leaving the College of Medicine campus. But when I left, and I'm guessing it's the same, you really need to have those full indirects in order to have the fees and tuition covered. And so without that, graduate students actually become quite expensive. So they are a very interesting group, and they certainly are very motivated to get presentations and publications. They also, depending upon the program that they are in, the graduate program they're in, may have other kinds of requirements, which may make them less available. But you also, with graduate students, you get that added satisfaction of contributing to somebody's career trajectory in a very special way. And assuming that their thesis or dissertation would come out of your lab, you suddenly get a lot of work and a lot of potential presentations and publications out of the work that they're doing. And hopefully they benefit a lot from rubbing shoulders with you. Again, we want to always kind of keep that win-win sort of a mentality. I want anybody who comes through my lab to feel like they've benefited at least as much as I have benefited from their presence. Any other questions? If not, I will mute and turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Mary. I will be using actually also my cell phone due to internet instability, but I'll start the presentation. I hope everyone could see the screen. And I am a basic science researcher, a translational researcher, and work in my lab requires quite a bit of technical expertise. We are an electrophysiology laboratory. That means highly specialized techniques. So maybe circling back to earlier question, for me, having a postdoc on the ground was very important. And however, reality is or was that finding the right postdoc with particular skill set was not an easy task. So from that standpoint, I started out with assistants from research assistants and undergraduates, and I was very much involved in the laboratory and still am to an extent. No longer doing patch clamp experiments, the classical electrophysiology experiments, but I jump on the microscope. We do also quite a bit of functional calcium imaging in muscle, as well as structural imaging in terms of immunolabeling. But now most of the work is done by trainees in the laboratory. And so our research spans the gamut of cardiac and actually neuro. I'm particularly interested in a regulation of sodium channels, but also how those sodium channels contribute to sudden unexplained death and epilepsy, particularly from the cardiac standpoint. So the first group in terms of individuals that I looked into hiring were that first category that Mary mentioned, volunteers, undergraduate students, or research assistants. And I lumped them in one category. And basically, we're talking about the supportive staff. So as I mentioned, in my setting, our research is very technically demanding, and there are many moving parts. So for me, it was critical to have individuals who were able to prepare solutions and kind of maintain, help maintain the lab. So very basic tasks. So obviously, previous experience was critical for me. And so I started with a job posting for a research assistant. And screening the applicants, basically recommendations were very important for me. So not just written recommendations, but actually reaching out to the individuals who previously worked with researchers, that particular research assistant. And particularly asking about their performance, their individual's ability to think, follow orders was quite important. And that is, I then followed up during the interview with a semi-hands-on skill assessment. And quite simply, I asked them to calculate the concentration. You know, I would like you to make this type of drug or whatnot, and on paper, not necessarily in the lab, how would you come up with concentration? So something like that, so they could prove their, at least, you know, perhaps past experience, but that they're able to think on their feet. Undergraduates are also a wonderful, wonderful support network, if you will, for a research lab. And you know, from undergraduates, usually an organic type of development where you establish rapport with particular undergraduate or undergraduates in class, and that was also early on. Being involved in lectures within the College of Pharmacy, got acquainted with a few undergraduates. One particularly expressed interest in laboratory scale or laboratory, and already knowing their ability to handle information, I was more eager to take that individual on. And obviously, depending on the experience of a particular individual, obviously, there has, you know, in my instance, was very much hands-on. First, showing the individual the various tasks that I would like them to perform, and then watching them perform the task. And obviously, that was can be quite hands-on involvement. Second category would be graduate students, and as Mary pointed out, that could be quite an investment. So, you know, choosing a graduate student is going to be quite important. And obviously, previous experiences, just like in research assistants or undergraduates or volunteers, will be critical. And then assessment of their capability to work in the lab. So again, hands-on skills. And you know, here, you know, I put down rotations. So depending what program you will be involved with, rotations offer a wonderful ability to interact with the trainee, with the graduate student, and getting to know the individual, getting to know their interests and the direction they want to take their research. And so, for instance, biophysics program would be such program that allows for, I believe there are 12-week rotations or about so in College of Pharmacy as well. within that program, rotations are encouraged. So again, depends on the program. There are programs that, for instance, in the College of Engineering, where a student has to be admitted to a lab. And then just as we'll talk about the postdoctoral, screen postdoctoral applicants, getting to know the individual through their connections will be quite important. A unique feature that I employ for graduate students, and sometimes for undergraduate students, depending on their interest, is a manuscript assessment. So I want to sense their intellectual curiosity. So I give them an article from our group, and I ask them to assess a particular figure. And particularly if there are two similar techniques being employed. And so using an example of structural imaging to a super resolution microscopy technique of storm and proximal ligation assay, which tell you information about proteins in a very, very small region within 20 nanometers or so. But they're different techniques, and they tell you slightly different information. Proximal ligation assay only tells you whether two proteins are within 40 nanometers of each other, and it's basically kind of a binary output. Versus storm, that gives you precise localization vis-a-vis other protein with 20 nanometer precision. So trying to assess with the limited knowledge of the field, what the individual would think, why one technique is used versus and the other, what information is given. Also, a simple thing as just defining what storm is vis-a-vis another a super resolution technique, for instance, TED. So assessing whether they're able to use the internet, even Wikipedia, or are they able to pull publications? So through that process, you'll be able to assess their intellectual curiosity. And as I mentioned, sometimes I employ that for undergraduate students who express interest potentially in graduate program and then in research. In the postdoctoral trainees. So postdoctoral trainees, as Mary already highlighted, should bring quite a bit to the table, from technical expertise to intellectual curiosity. So they should be able to drive a project. So outside of the technical proficiency, there should be a publication and funding track record. Also depends on the technique. So I mentioned, so right now, currently I have 4 postdoctoral trainees in my laboratory, 2 of whom are electrophysiologists. One electrophysiologist, my first postdoc, I actually hired him out of industry. And it was a targeted hire vis-a-vis the technique he was able to bring. Obviously, he did not have a funding track record. Publication track record was strong, however. And based on recommendations, not just a letter of with mentor or collaborators. I actually Zoomed or at that point Skyped with that individual's collaborators, as well as fellow graduate students. So I asked the postdoctoral trainee to provide me with names of a couple of students he worked with and help them out. And so I was able to assess the personality of the individual, the dynamics in a particular setting, and also at least by word of mouth, their capability in the lab. And then I asked the applicant himself to provide me with some raw data, some samples. So in my instance, current recordings. And then I'm able to assess as an electrophysiologist the quality of a recording, which is just critical. So that's, from technical standpoint, as that is a must. Then, their overall trajectory and their vision for the future. what do you want to accomplish? How do you want to accomplish it? So at that point, I actually would like to see someone thinking already of funding strategy. So as a postdoctoral fellow applying for a postdoctoral fellowship. So already it's I want to see whether that's on someone's radar, but upfront I tell them that is an expectation in the lab, that after a year in the lab, I expect them to apply for that. And actually that individual we just got word that he received American Heart Association postdoctoral fellowship. He's been in the lab a little bit over a year and a half at this point, but managed to generate quite a bit of data expressed that interest in pursuing an academic career. So that's going back to the carrots that Mary highlighted. We're able to provide that carrot. So that's a necessary step, necessary milestone in the career of a future academician. So keeping those things in mind, basically, yes, we want someone to help us conduct our research, but we also are mentors. So we want to provide that fertile ground for an individual to succeed as a researcher by learning techniques and such, but also helping them grow, depending on what the goals are. And that's basically our role as mentors. So with that, I would like to address any questions that you may have.
Questions, anyone? I have one that occurred to me that both of you could answer. What about assessing the fit of a candidate into the culture of your lab? There's something you look for, and how do you assess?
I'm sorry, Stuart, you're not coming through well. Can you maybe lower your microphone? And
I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you.
Yes, what about the culture of your lab and assessing how a person will fit in with the other people that are already in your lab?
Wonderful. And I see someone ask very similar, Aaron asked a very similar question in the chat. So that is very, very important. I would say a critical step. And what I would encourage is, and what I've done in the past at all levels, is actually having that individual, the applicant, meet with the trainees in the laboratory. So when we were hiring, for instance, a postdoctoral fellow from abroad, we had a Zoom session where essentially that applicant was able to meet individually with other trainees. And based on the conversation, we're able to assess, how good of a fit an individual is. And obviously, in the laboratory, I mean, science is a team sport. And from that perspective, it's critical that one has a team player joining the lab and enhancing that overall the culture of the lab. So in a way, all points of interactions are a way of assessing whether someone's a good fit. But giving that opportunity for others in your group to actually help screen and help to interview the individual is quite important. Great question.
And I would concur that particularly when you are hiring somebody, a research assistant or a postdoc, somebody who will be full-time, you really want to know that other people in your lab have met with that person and also have a good reaction to them. For students, I did not do that because they were typically in the lab like 3 to 6 hours a week, depending on how many course credits they were taking. But one of the things that I hadn't mentioned before in terms of that notion of vertical team is that the postdoc or graduate students would run a weekly seminar for the undergraduates and the volunteers so that there would be an additional learning component to their experience, and it gives teaching experience then to the grad student or the postdoc. Oh, and now Aaron's got another question about what happens when things don't work out. And I apologize, they're doing construction directly above me. I'll try to mute as soon as I'm done answering my part of that question. I hired long distance, a research coordinator who totally bombed out. And after she was with me for a couple of months, it became clear that no amount of my training and supervision and rehabilitation would get her to the level of competence that I needed her to be. And I had to work with HR to terminate her. I had another postdoc who did not work out, but it became clear to him that it was a very uncomfortable fit, and he chose to withdraw. So that doesn't happen very often, but it will happen from time to time, likely over the course of your career. And so you really want to start by working on additional supervision and corrective actions. But if that isn't working out, I think you do need to move forward with the termination. That's never the starting point, unless it's such an egregious ethical violation that you have no other option. But typically, extra supervision would be enough to kind of coach the person through, but not always.
No, that's a great point, and maybe to add to that, as I mentioned, science is a team sport, so we work with other laboratories. So developing that close relationship with collaborators. So I'm fortunate enough to actually have a handful of very close collaborators. And essentially the mentoring process, I think it's again, just like science, it's a team sport. So I'm very much involved in mentoring of my colleagues, trainees, and my collaborators are very much involved in mentoring my trainees to a greater or lesser extent. There's one very close collaborator of mine who is very much involved, and I'm very much involved in mentoring his trainees. So that could be that that extra piece that could be provided there on top of close hands-on training and kind of supervision that Mary alluded to. But yes, certainly situation will arise, and oftentimes they arise from also I guess in a way misplaced expectations, and so it's communication is just critical with trainees. So we have a weekly lab meeting. I have individual, again, weekly meetings with each trainee, which can last anywhere from, I guess, 15 minutes. There's really no updates and just checking in, to up to hours, where we're really dive into the data and we try to make sense out of it. And also, there's life outside of science. It's hard for us to believe. But life happens, and also just being in tuned to the needs, trainees' needs, and what is happening around them. Obviously, they're there, to learn from you, to do science, but the outside world can have an impact on performance expectations and such. So communication is critical piece of it. But as Mary pointed out, sometimes actions need to be taken, and it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing. I hope that addressed your question. Great. And obviously, if you have any questions, I believe Stuart has our contact information. Feel free to reach out. I'm an early stage investigator, still an assistant professor. I'll be soon submitting my dossier, but a lot of mistakes I've done in the recent past are still fresh. More than happy to share my experiences with you, and Recently, fortunately, we're able to grow exponentially our laboratory, our team. As I mentioned, I have 4 postdocs. And we're still recruiting, probably more at the graduate student level, so we've gone through the growing pains and some disappointments as well. So I'm more than happy to chat with you about strategies and anything.
I know Prej obviously uses some hands-on activities for interviewing. Do you both of you use behavioral interview questions where you ask, like, tell me about a time when you did something in the lab, or helping to recruit patients to a clinical trial survey, or do you use those kind of questions when you're interviewing candidates?
Sure. I like to understand beyond what is described in the CV, kind of what the job that they did really entail, some of the nuts and bolts of it, what worked, what didn't work, what did they learn, what are they hoping to learn in their next position? Absolutely.
No, I think that's a great point. And also sometimes, also depending on the level, but if we're hiring someone more senior with some experience, or even a graduate student, how they handle these type of situations, but also how do they handle situation where experiments didn't go well. Because that also gives you insight to how the individual is thinking and how they're able to deal with that. But yes, again, it's kind of circling back to a communication. So having the conversation with the applicant and thinking how they operate, and then the kind of scenario-based questions are a good tool of assessing that.
Is anybody out there looking to hire someone? Are there some issues that you are thinking about that you'd like to ask our presenters about?
So I've noticed there were a handful of questions for Mary. Where do you find this? And what listserv, et cetera, et cetera. Word of mouth is also a huge component here. So reach out to your network. Let them know that you're hiring. If you land a grant, let them know that land the grant, but I need people. So it's not only a way of bragging about your success, which is awesome and should be recognized, but also indicates to your network that you're doing well and you're growing. You need people. So that's word of mouth is huge. It's a huge component, and so don't be shy. Your former mentors, colleagues, PIs next door that you know. Because yes, if you're looking for someone specialized, then the network, gets much smaller. But you could set a wide net that way as well.
I had a question about employees who don't work out. I did hear that there were 2 different experiences where one employee actually chose to leave after realizing that he was not a fit, while the other employee had to actually be dismissed through HR. And I'm just wondering, those are 2 kind of different approaches, and HR will tell you not to actually directly talk to the person almost. And that kind of sets you up in a kind of difficult position. At least it did me in one situation where I actually wanted to talk to this person and say that things are not working out. But HR said, don't do that. We will have to do that. You can't tell the person that they don't have a position in they're not long-term realistically going to have a position in your lab.
Let me talk just a little bit more about these 2 situations. In the situation where the person chose to withdraw, he, for very personal reasons, was not happy in Columbus and did not feel that he was doing a good job in the postdoc, and he was accurate. He was doing a terrible job. I was giving him, again, weekly supervision, just as Prez was talking about with his his staff, I have weekly meetings set up with all of my lab staff. And in that case, he just was bottoming out, but had the insight to realize it was a terrible fit, and he chose to withdraw. So that was easy. The other person, I was giving ongoing corrective feedback as part of my typical way of operating. I would be giving feedback to anybody. Just in this case, the valence of the feedback was pretty much all negative. And it just kept increasing to the point that in working with HR, we came up with a termination plan. But the feedback that I was giving was part of my weekly supervision that I would provide to anybody.
And HR requires that there be a documentation of supervision and lack of performance. What are the acceptable ways of doing that in terms of progress reports, et cetera, that HR would actually accept as proof that there was ongoing lack of performance?
Well, that's one. I don't want to get too in the weeds on that, because HR will work with you. And yes, can be a little awkward when you're really needing to do that kind of a severance plan with somebody. And I've also done it for an administrative staff once. This is, again, pretty dated information now. And HR has certainly had some change in practice over the years. But if you are thinking you may need to terminate somebody, it is important that you work with HR on that, but make sure that you would normally have some kind of supervision notes that you take, however you do that. I kept weekly paper files for all of my staff. Now that we've moved to so much on electronic, I have computer files that I take notes on every week in supervision. So if there's a problem, it's part of my ongoing documentation that I would be able to go back to and demonstrate if needed. Unfortunately, those don't come up very often. It's clearly the exception, not the rule, that things don't work out with a staff member.
No, that's a great point. And, just keeping notes when you meet with trainees. And for me, I don't remember what we talked about last week. So it's a way of refreshing my memory, and then kind of, having an actionable plan. So also depending on the individual, if the trajectory isn't as such as we planned out initially, I would start engaging the trainee and encouraging them to map out their own short-term trajectory. So, actionable plan for a particular week, and having that communicated to you via email. So in terms of documentation, voila, there's that, documentation, electronic documentation. But I think more importantly, it's actually having the trainee really assess themselves and do a little bit of soul searching, how things are, what's happening. So obviously as mentors, we want the best outcome for our trainee, but sometimes things don't work out. So recently, had a graduate student who wasn't performing well, and turns out there was it was multifactorial, but focusing at task at hand, particularly research-wise, he ultimately did not want to pursue an academic career. So that was, I think, a watershed moment when he realized that he's not cut out for academia. And it was a longer process where, through kind of, developing this weekly plan and such, and having discussion, he realized that industry was the way to go. And once he identified that, he was able to identify the need, or basically what he would need from me in order to succeed in the industry. In other words, as PhD, absolutely necessary. But, helping, as a mentor, and I have to admit, my collaborator was of tremendous help here as well, hence the team effort. But helping my trainee who's not succeeding in the lab to actually succeed in another setting. So once he realized that, kind of setting the roadmap for, what is the most efficient way of obtaining a master's degree, and how do we get there? So I think it was somewhat of a happy ending, but it's not always as such. But I think taking that approach of engaging the trainee, empowering the trainee to kind of start coming up with a plan and realizing and realizing where they want to go, helping them realize that. And obviously there are other things happening in life, and that's so it's very difficult to speak in general terms, but I think having that communication open, having that network is also very helpful, and documentation, whatever form. I think it's always a good idea, even before any clouds appear on the horizon.
And on the more positive front, having that documentation is helpful when they come to you for a letter of recommendation, because then you'll be able to produce very specific examples of their successes and why they'd be good for whatever it is they're applying for.
Good point, Stuart.
You're a very quiet group. I'm surprised you don't have more questions for our speakers. We've got them here. You got to take advantage of this opportunity.
I'll ask a question for both of you. I was thinking more about, Mary, what you were saying when you were talking about trying to have the right carrots for the students at different levels. I find that, as you've mentioned, the quality of OSU students is very good, particularly the undergraduate level, which is kind of where I'm recruiting currently, that there's a lot of competition. And so I wonder, for somebody who's newer and doesn't have maybe some of the shinier carrots that more established faculty members have, what are the things that you would recommend focusing on with being competitive or attractive to research assistants?
So for you, you would be recruiting from neuroscience and or psychology, most likely. So right. I would befriend people who are teaching some of the large classes and let them know, or just reach out to them and say, this is what I'm looking for. If you don't mind, just at the end of one of your classes, just give a quick little, 2-sentence, Dr. Mo is looking for undergraduate research assistants in her lab that studies blah, blah, blah. And here's her contact info. And if they do that at the beginning of a semester and just do a little advertisement for you, as you know, we've got really top neuroscience and psychology undergrads, and there's a lot of them. And the other thing you could do would be to contact some more senior faculty and ask them if they have overflow applicants to send them your way. For example, I get at least one a week, and right now I'm not taking undergraduates. I will just forward those all on to you.
Okay.
Well, also an idea that if you're involved in teaching, also depends what you're teaching, but what I try doing is I'm usually very, very excited about my research. So I try to pepper in some of the techniques or, something unique to my research or, tied to my research. So I could, pepper that information in so the students get to see what I do. And then, at the end, just tying back at the end of the lecture, tying back to, if I want to see more of the school stuff, feel free to contact me. So in a way of, advertisement, unofficial advertisement.
Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank our presenters. And again, if you have questions you'd like to talk with them more in private, you can reach out to me. I can give you the contact information, or you can look them up. And appreciate you all coming, especially appreciate you, Mary and Prez, for talking with the K scholars. And I hope you all have a very good holiday season. We'll see you in the new year.